Upon hearing stories of a ghost terrorizing a family in the south of the country, a U.S. military general decided to go investigate himself whether these stories were true or not. Marching down to the haunted house with an entourage of soldiers, horses, and a large wagon, the general doesn't even get to the house when strange occurrences begin. Their wagon suddenly comes to a halt, and despite the fact that it wasn't broken or stuck, and despite all attempts to get it moving, it wouldn't start. The general and his men try repeatedly to push the wagon forward, but it will not budge. Suddenly, they hear a disembodied female voice, saying, "All right, General. Let the wagon move on. I will see you tonight." Then, with so very little effort, the wagon starts moving again. The general and his men continue on to the haunted house, but what happens when they get there is, well, the kind of thing you'd see in a Hollywood movie. So sit back, relax, as we go through one of the most frightening ghost hauntings to have ever happened in the United States of America. It all began with a 19th century farmer and his family who resided along the Red River, now known as Adams, in northwest Robertson County, Tennessee. Their home was large but simple, surrounded by farmland which they tended to, and they lived a quiet country life. But from the year 1817, this peaceful and loving family came under attack by a mostly invisible entity that was able to speak, affect the physical environment, and even shapeshift, leading to unimaginable occurrences, horror, and even death. John, his wife Lucy and their several children had been living in their farmhouse and taking care of their farm for 13 years since, with no particular issues. But all that changed when, one day, John encountered an apparition, the apparition of a strange creature resembling a big dog, which had what seemed like the head of a rabbit. Taken aback and naturally disturbed by what he was seeing, John fires his guns at the animal several times, but it disappeared. John returned to the house disturbed, but still believing he must have made some sort of mistake, that his eyes were deceiving him. So he decided to put this bizarre incident out of his mind, but little did he know that the strange occurrences were only just beginning. That same night, John's entire family started hearing noises all around the house. They heard knocking along the door and walls, and invisible dogs fighting. The sounds continued all night long, and few times, John and his older sons would run outside, to try and see if they could catch what they thought was the person behind the noises, but every time they run out, there was no one there. As the days go by, the phenomena grew in both intensity and frequency, with the beatings on the walls getting so loud the children were unable to sleep. And, eventually, the phenomena moved inside the house, as John's younger children complained that it sounded like rats were gnawing at their bedposts. And of course, despite thoroughly searching, no rats were found. Soon enough, whatever it was that was haunting this peaceful family began pulling sheets from the children's bed, scratching them, and even pulling their hair. And it seemed this malevolent force was only getting stronger and stronger. Eventually, the family started hearing a female voice all around the house. It was soft and faint at first, coming through the walls as unintelligible whispers, and with each passing day, the voice became louder and clearer. The voice, echoing throughout the house, would sing hymns, quote Bible scripture, and even started having conversations. And soon enough, she started referring to the people in the house by name. And one day, the entity, referring to John as Old Jack, announces that she intended to kill him, signaling this intention through curses, threats, and afflictions, as John thereafter started experiencing paralysis in his mouth. When asked why she wanted to kill John, no clear reason was given, except that she accused John of being a bad man. At this point, John was frightened and confused, yet is still reluctant to ask any authorities, religious or otherwise, for help. After all, he was an elder of the Red River Baptist Church, living right in the middle of the Bible Belt. To announce to the church, and the town at large, that evil forces were in his home trying to kill him, was a dicey proposition in a country that was still killing people accused of being witches just a century before. So John decided to go to his best friend, James Johnson, for help. At first, Johnson was understandably skeptical, and requests to spend the night at the house with John and his family, so he could see what was happening for himself. That night, as they were all asleep, Johnston was awakened by the same phenomena, his bed covers yanked, and he has even slapped in the face. He called out to the spirit, asking what it wanted. There was no answer, but the activity ceased. In the morning, Johnson tells John that whatever was in the house was a spirit, just like in the Bible. He convinced John to share these bizarre occurrences with a local trusted preacher, and the community at large. So John does, and word of the haunting spreads far and wide, drawing more attention to the house, and this increased attention seemed to make the evil spirit grow even stronger. Neighbors, passers-by, and even people traveling great distances would come to the house to try and figure out what the spirit was, and each interaction yielded a different response from the entity. Now engaging in full conversations, the spirit would repeat, word for word, 2 sermons given 13 miles apart at the same time. It was well acquainted with Bible scripture, and appeared to enjoy religious arguments. In more amusing interactions, the entity would share gossip about activities in other households, and at times, appeared to leave for brief moments to visit and spy on homes, so as to return with gossip answers after an inquiry. John's best friend, James Johnson, had a son who devised a test for the entity, something no one outside their family would know, asking the entity what his Dutch step-grandmother in North Carolina would say to the slaves if she thought they had done something wrong. The entity replied with his grandmother's accent, "Hut tut, what has happened now?" In another instance, a man from England stopped to visit, and offered to investigate. On remarking on the Englishman's family overseas, the entity suddenly began to mimic his English parents. Then, early in the morning, the entity woke the Englishman to voices of his parents, worried, as they too had heard his voice. The Englishman quickly left that morning, and later wrote to John and his family that the entity had visited his family in England. He apologized for his skepticism. Sometimes though, the spirit displayed a form of kindness, especially towards Lucy, John's wife, whom it described as the most perfect woman to walk to earth. The spirit would give Lucy fresh fruit, and sing hymns to her, and also showed one of John's sons, John Jr., a measure of respect. The spirit offered diverse explanations of why it had appeared, tying its origins to the disturbance of a Native American burial mound located on the property. Some locals checked the farm, and confirmed that there were indeed burial mounds, Native American burial mounds, present on the farm. One time, when asked who it was, the entity responded, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy but have been disturbed and made unhappy. I am the spirit of a person who was buried in the woods nearby, and the grave was disturbed, my bones disinterred and scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house. I am here looking for that tooth." At another time, the entity said it was a spirit from everywhere: heaven, hell, the earth. I'm in the air, the houses, any place at any time, have been created millions of years. Despite all these different explanations the spirit gave, the one that people stuck with the most, and that gave the spirit the name it would eventually be referred to, was the spirit's confession that it was Kate Batts. Kate Batts was a neighbor of John's, and she was already viewed with suspicion throughout the community for behaving in what they called strange ways. However, it was Kate's brother-in-law, Benjamin, who had business dealings with John, and at some point they had a dispute, which made their business go sour. As the years went by, local people twisted facts and said the dispute was between Kate and John instead. Of course, Kate vehemently denied all accusations that she was involved in witchcraft, or responsible for this spirit in any way, or even had business dealings with John. Still, people just stuck to calling the ghost Kate, and the idea that a witch was involved has stuck throughout history. As news of the sensational witch spread far and wide, a general in the United States Army caught wind of it, and, intrigued by tales of the haunting, decided to venture down to Red River himself to investigate. The story was of particular interest to the general, because 3 of John's sons had fought under him in the army. So, taking with him an entourage of soldiers, horses, and a large wagon, the general sets out for John's house, but he doesn't even get to the house when strange occurrences begin. The wagon suddenly comes to a halt, and despite the fact that it wasn't broken or stuck, and despite all attempts to get it moving, it wouldn't start. The general and his men try repeatedly to push the wagon forward, but it just will not budge. Then suddenly, they hear a disembodied female voice, saying, "All right, General. Let the wagon move on. I will see you tonight." Then with so very little effort, the wagon starts to move again. The general and his men continue on to the haunted house, but what happened when they get there can only be described as the kind of thing you'd see in a Hollywood movie. Arriving at the house, they set up tents in the yard to sleep there overnight. His men were naturally a little perplexed, but not rattled, and remained undaunted by the events so far. In fact, one of the soldiers even proudly taunted the spirit, proclaiming himself to be a witch tamer. He pulled out a pistol with a silver bullet, telling the rest of the soldiers that the witch won't bother him, because she's too scared of what's in his gun. Upon saying this, what happened next seemed like a scene straight out of a horror movie. The soldier, this witch tamer, starts screaming as his body jerks uncontrollably in several different directions, until eventually, he is literally flung out of the camp by an unseen force. The rest of the soldiers were so terrified that they begged the general to leave, which they hurriedly did, and they were spotted in Springfield very early the next morning. This general, whose name was Andrew Johnson, would later go on to become President of the United States. Back at the haunted house, the witch, besides wanting to kill John, has another big objective in mind. For whatever reason, she seems to focus a lot of her aggression and violence on John's youngest daughter, Betsy. Betsy was constantly getting scratched, slapped, punched, and would even get stuck with pins by the witch. What's even more strange was the fact that the witch had a specific problem with Betsy's love life. She did not want Betsy to marry her childhood sweetheart and fiancé, Joshua Gardner. Threatening, harassing, assaulting, and even killing are usual traits of a ghost haunting. But being against a specific marriage match, that is incredibly strange. The repeated threats from the witch against the marriage lead Betsy to the brink of madness. But being a witness to the violence and rage of the witch, and knowing what she was capable of, Betsy could not risk her safety, or her family's safety, let alone the safety of Joshua, the love of her life. And so, with a broken heart, she eventually meets up with Joshua, and tearfully ends their engagement. Unfortunately, it seems forcing Betsy to call off her engagement wasn't enough to satisfy the witch. Her most horrific act was yet to come. She had made it crystal clear that it was her intention to kill John, vowing to kill him time and time again. And as a result, John starts to experience erratic and uncontrolled body movements, facial twitching, trouble swallowing, and even paralysis in his mouth. And on December 20th, 1820, John Bell breathes his last, and dies. His family wakes up to find him dead in his bed, and they also find a vial of a strange black liquid in a cupboard, which they later realized was poison after feeding it to a cat. And so it is believed that the witch, by whatever means, had acquired poison, and somehow poisoned John Bell to his death, even as she had repeatedly threatened she was going to do. John's funeral was one of the largest ever held in Robertson County, as people came from far and wide, some who knew him personally or by reputation, while others came out of curiosity regarding the haunting that apparently killed a man. 3 priests eulogized John, while the funeral attendees stood silent and respectful. But as the mourners prepare to leave the funeral grounds, a voice suddenly breaks the silence. It's the witch. she interrupted the mourners by laughing and singing drinking songs, apparently celebrating the accomplishment of her long-stated goal, that of killing John. After John's death, the witch told the family it was going to leave, but would return after 7 years. And, shockingly enough, in 7 years, John's children, still living in the house, alert the community that the witch was indeed back, with the same knocking sounds and harassments as before. However, it seems the witch's second coming was less evil. She is said to have had long conversations with John Jr., would make some noise around the house, and eventually left again. And, like the first time, she gives the family a date for her return: 1935. Some sources claim she never returned after that. But descendants of the Bell family say that the witch, in fact, never truly left, and that she still haunts the Bell family and the property they lived on to this day. Tourists flock to Adams, Tennessee, to see the Bell Witch Cave, made famous by the tales of the haunting. Although the cave wasn't originally a focus of supernatural activity when the haunting first started, it is the only part of the Bell property that still looks much like it would have in the early 1800s, as the original house has long since been torn down. So visitors go to this undisturbed cave, and they report supernatural phenomena. It is fair to say though, that many historians doubt a lot of the lore surrounding the Bell Witch haunting. They insist that many accounts, including that of Andrew Jackson's visit, are not only unverified, but likely false. However, if we take into account the fact that even modern tourists who visit the Bell Witch Cave report supernatural experiences, one has to wonder whether there may be some truth to the story. Thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments below what you think about this story. Did it really happen? Or is it just a result of people's overactive imaginations? Until next time, look after each other.